If a machine refuses every expert, maybe it's waiting for the one person who truly remembers it. Kyle Mercer's laugh echoed across the sun-baked tarmac at Fort Redstone as the fated One Huey sat motionless beneath the relentless afternoon sky, its olive-drab skin shimmering beneath waves of heat rising from the concrete. Around the aircraft, 12 technicians surrounded it like surgeons who had exhausted every instrument in the operating room. Rugged laptops glowed with flawless diagnostic reports. Digital multimeters confirmed every circuit. Fuel pressure remained exactly where it should be. Electrical systems answered every command without hesitation. According to every modern tool available to the United States Army, the helicopter was perfectly healthy. Yet the old Huey remained silent, its rotor blades frozen against a cloudless blue sky as though it had made a decision no computer could understand. Kyle folded his arms and shook his head before planting the heel of his boot lightly against the landing skid. "Come on," he muttered with a grin. "You're making us all look stupid." A few younger technicians chuckled while Lieutenant Noah Brooks glanced impatiently at his watch. Distinguished visitors would arrive in less than an hour for the restoration ceremony, and the centerpiece of the event refused to come alive. Every passing minute tightened the pressure across the flight line. Standing nearly 30 feet away, unnoticed by most of the crew, was an elderly man wearing faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and an old olive field jacket that looked older than several people working around the helicopter. His white hair stirred gently in the warm breeze, and one weathered hand rested inside the pocket of the jacket, while the other held a small leather tool pouch polished smooth by decades of careful use. He did not stare at the technicians. He did not study their computers. His pale blue eyes never left the helicopter itself. They moved slowly across the rivets, the engine housing, the rotor mast, and finally settled somewhere near the left engine cowling, as if he were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. Kyle noticed him only after, catching the old man in the corner of his eye. "Sir," he called loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "this isn't a museum tour. You're standing inside a restricted maintenance zone." The old man calmly shifted his gaze toward the young technician without changing his expression. "I know," he answered quietly. His voice carried the rough texture of age, but none of its uncertainty. Kyle smirked. "Unless you know magic, you're probably better off watching from outside the fence." More laughter rolled across the flight line. Lieutenant Brooks joined in with an amused smile before adding, "We've got certified avionics specialists, restoration engineers, and factory consultants working this problem. I think we've got it covered." The old man nodded once, neither offended nor defensive. He simply looked back toward the Huey. For several long seconds, he remained completely still, almost blending into the quiet background of humming generators and distant maintenance vehicles. Then, without taking another step forward, he spoke softly enough that only those nearest could hear. "She's trying to start." The laughter came even faster this time. Kyle rubbed a hand across his forehead and exchanged amused looks with the others. "Trying," he repeated. "It hasn't made a sound all day." The old man's eyes never moved from the aircraft. "Not with the engine," he said. "With everything else." Kyle Mercer let out a theatrical sigh before closing the lid of his laptop with more force than necessary. Around him, the maintenance crew slowly drifted away from the helicopter, each technician wearing the same exhausted expression that came after 6 hours of solving nothing. Diagnostic software continued insisting that every major system was functioning within factory specifications. Fuel pressure remained stable. Hydraulic lines showed no leaks. Electrical continuity measured perfectly across every circuit they had tested. The old helicopter should have started on the first attempt, yet it remained as silent as an abandoned monument. Lieutenant Noah Brooks folded the maintenance report beneath his arm and walked toward the elderly man. His polished boots clicked sharply across the concrete before he stopped several feet away. "Sir, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this aircraft has been inspected by people who rebuild military aviation systems for a living." The old man looked at him politely. "I do not doubt their skill." Brooks nodded as if the discussion had ended. "Good. Then I suggest we let them continue working." The old man offered the faintest smile. "That depends on what they are working on." Kyle overheard the exchange and laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "He thinks we are chasing the wrong problem." Several younger technicians grinned. One shook his head while another muttered that old mechanics always blamed computers whenever they ran out of answers. Kyle stepped closer until he stood beside the elderly man, pointing confidently toward the open engine compartment. Every sensor has been checked twice. Every connector has been inspected. Every maintenance bulletin has been followed exactly. He tapped the rugged tablet in his hand. This system knows more about this helicopter than any person possibly could. The old man's eyes drifted away from the tablet and settled once again on the aircraft. Warm wind carried the faint scent of hydraulic fluid across the flight line, while a distant cargo aircraft climbed into the brilliant afternoon sky. The Huey remained perfectly still beneath the sunlight, almost dignified in its silence. Computers remember specifications, the old man said quietly. Machines remember people. Another wave of laughter rolled through the maintenance crew. Kyle rubbed his temples dramatically. That is a great line. Maybe we should print it on a coffee mug. Even Lieutenant Brooks smiled despite himself. The old man ignored every reaction. Instead, he slowly walked several feet toward the helicopter without touching it. His pale blue eyes traveled carefully along the rivet lines beneath the engine cowling before stopping at a small access panel barely larger than a sheet of notebook paper. It appeared perfectly aligned to everyone else. The bolts were evenly torqued. The paint showed no scratches. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Yet the old man's expression changed almost imperceptibly, as though something deep in his memory had quietly answered a question no one else had thought to ask. He raised one weathered finger toward the panel. Who opened that? Kyle answered immediately. Nobody needed to. Why? The old man asked. Kyle shrugged with complete confidence. Because there is nothing behind it that could cause this failure. The old man remained silent for several long seconds before asking one final question in the same calm voice. Did the helicopter tell you that? Or did the computer? The smile slowly faded, but not because anyone had begun to believe him. They faded because the old man refused to argue. Kyle Mercer had expected stubbornness, maybe even wounded pride. Instead, he found himself facing something far more unsettling. Complete certainty. Eli Harrison stood quietly beneath the afternoon sun, his eyes fixed on the small access panel, while the steady breeze carried the faint smell of warm oil across the silent flight line. He neither defended his opinion nor tried to convince anyone. He simply waited, as though time itself would eventually explain what words never could. Lieutenant Noah Brooks finally broke the silence. Sir, every maintenance procedure for this restoration has followed Army technical manuals exactly. Eli nodded once. I believe you. Brooks frowned slightly. Then why keep questioning our work? Eli looked toward the Huey again. Because manuals describe how a helicopter should age. They do not describe how one actually does. Kyle folded his arms tighter across his chest. That helicopter has been rebuilt from the frame up. Half the components inside it are newer than I am. Eli answered without looking away from the aircraft. The other half remembers every season before you were born. Several technicians exchanged amused glances, but the laughter that had come so easily only minutes earlier no longer carried the same confidence. Something about the old man's calm voice refused to disappear from their thoughts. Airman Ethan Cole had been standing near the fuel truck for most of the afternoon, quietly assisting wherever someone needed an extra pair of hands. Unlike the senior technicians, he had spent more time watching Eli than watching the computers. There was nothing dramatic about the elderly veteran. No raised voice. No attempt to prove himself. Yet every time Eli studied the helicopter, his eyes moved with remarkable precision, lingering only on places that seemed ordinary until he looked at them. Ethan noticed that Eli had never once glanced at the diagnostic screens. It was almost as though he already knew they would have nothing useful to say. Kyle stepped toward the access panel and ran his hand across its smooth painted surface. Look at it, he said confidently. Factory alignment. Perfect seal. Every bolt torqued correctly. There is absolutely no reason to remove this panel. Eli slowly walked closer until he stood only a few feet away. His weathered fingers remained inside the pocket of his old field jacket. He never reached toward the helicopter. He simply studied the narrow gap between the panel and the surrounding metal. It sits lower on the rear corner, he said quietly. Kyle leaned closer before shaking his head almost immediately. That difference is barely visible. It is visible, Eli replied. Only if you know where to look. Lieutenant Brooks sighed. Sir, with respect, Tiny imperfections happened during restoration. Eli finally turned toward him, his pale blue eyes calm and thoughtful. No, he answered softly. Tiny imperfections happen after someone decides they are too small to matter. The words settled over the maintenance crew with unexpected weight. Ethan looked back at the helicopter, narrowing his eyes as sunlight reflected across the faded olive paint. At first he saw nothing. Then, as the angle of the light shifted ever so slightly, the smallest shadow appeared beneath one edge of the panel before disappearing again. It lasted less than a second. Ethan felt a strange tightening in his chest. He looked at Eli, who had already returned his attention to the silent Huey, standing with the quiet patience of someone who had spent an entire lifetime learning that machines often revealed their secrets only to those willing to stop talking long enough to listen. The silence lingered longer than anyone expected before Kyle Mercer finally shook his head with a dismissive chuckle. "All right," he said, spreading his hands toward the helicopter. "Let us settle this once and for all." He walked directly to the small access panel and tapped it twice with the back of his knuckles. The hollow metallic sound echoed softly beneath the broad rotor blades. This panel covers a routing channel, wiring harness, support brackets. Nothing here can keep the engine from starting. Several technicians nodded immediately. One even pulled up the maintenance diagram on his tablet and enlarged the schematic until the tiny compartment filled the screen. Every labeled component matched the restoration checklist perfectly. Lieutenant Noah Brooks glanced between the digital blueprint and the old helicopter before offering the tablet toward Eli Harrison. "You can see it yourself," he said politely. "There is nothing unusual behind this panel." Eli never looked at the screen. His eyes remained fixed on the narrow seam where sunlight traced an almost invisible silver line across the painted metal. The warm breeze shifted again, carrying the faint smell of heated aluminum and old hydraulic fluid. Somewhere in the distance, another helicopter lifted into the sky, its rotor wash rolling across the airfield like distant thunder. Eli listened without moving. Then he quietly asked, "Who painted this aircraft?" Kyle answered immediately, "Our restoration team." "Who installed this panel?" "Our restoration team." "Who verified its alignment?" Kyle smiled confidently. "I did." Eli nodded slowly, accepting every answer without argument. "Then you trusted your own work." Kyle frowned. "Of course I did." "Did anyone trust the helicopter?" The question drew puzzled looks from everyone standing nearby. One technician quietly muttered that helicopters did not earn trust. They followed engineering. Eli smiled faintly, not because he found the comment amusing, but because he had heard similar answers decades before. He slowly stepped closer until only a few feet separated him from the silent Huey. He leaned forward just enough for the afternoon sunlight to strike the panel from a different angle. His pale, blue eyes narrowed. "See there," he whispered. Nobody answered. Kyle folded his arms. "See what?" Eli remained perfectly still. "The paint reflects differently on the lower corner." Kyle crouched beside the panel and stared for several seconds before standing again with an impatient sigh. "That is just old paint." Eli gently shook his head. "No, that is fresh pressure." The technicians exchanged uncertain glances. Brooks looked down again, trying to spot whatever Eli claimed to see, but the panel appeared completely ordinary. There was no dent, no crack, no chipped paint, nothing that justified dismantling a perfectly sealed section of the helicopter. Kyle laughed once more, although this time it sounded noticeably forced. "You were seeing ghosts." For the first time that afternoon, Eli's expression softened into something almost nostalgic. His weathered fingers slowly slipped inside the pocket of his faded field jacket and rested against the smooth leather of the old tool pouch hidden there. The familiar texture beneath his fingertips instantly stilled his breathing. The sounds of generators, distant aircraft, and casual conversation began to fade into the background. Even the warm sunlight across the flight line seemed to lose its weight. The old leather carried a scent no one else could detect anymore, one that had never completely disappeared despite half a century of careful storage. Oil, canvas, hot metal, and rain-soaked earth still lingered inside its worn seams. Eli closed his eyes for the briefest moment, and somewhere deep within a memory that had remained silent for decades quietly began to awaken. The rough leather beneath Eli Harrison's fingertips carried him across more than 50 years in a single heartbeat. The bright afternoon sun over Fort Redstone dissolved into a pale tropical dawn where heavy air clung to every breath, and the steady rhythm of distant rotor blades blended with birds hidden deep beyond the tree line. He was 24 then, wearing stained coveralls instead of an old field jacket, kneeling beside another Huey whose faded olive paint had long since surrendered its shine beneath relentless heat, rain, and endless flights. Every mechanic on the line had been handed technical manuals. Every experienced crew chief knew that after enough missions, the helicopter began writing its own manual. Eli remembered running his palm across the same section of the engine cowling before every departure, not because regulations demanded it, but because the aircraft always spoke through tiny details that instruments ignored. A bolt that felt warmer than yesterday, a panel sitting lower than it had the week before, a vibration that could be felt through fingertips before it could ever be measured by gauges. The older crew chief who had trained him, Sergeant Frank Donnelly, had once smiled while handing him the very leather tool pouch he still carried today. "Do not just inspect her," Frank had said. "Listen, she will tell you where she hurts." At first, Eli thought it was only another colorful saying passed between mechanics. Then, after months spent keeping helicopters flying day after day, he realized Frank had never been speaking in metaphors. Machines developed habits just as people did. They flexed differently after years of work. They settled into patterns no blueprint could predict. One humid morning, another Huey had refused to start despite every gauge reporting normal conditions. 3 mechanics searched electrical systems, while another replaced a fuel component that never needed replacing. Eli quietly walked around the helicopter twice before stopping beside a small access panel almost identical to the one standing before him now. He noticed the rear edge sat no more than the thickness of a dime lower than the front. Most people never would have seen it. He opened the compartment anyway. Hidden behind the panel, a small support bracket had shifted just enough to place constant pressure against a cable bundle whenever the engine warmed. Nothing had failed yet. Nothing appeared broken. But the helicopter had already begun warning anyone willing to notice. Frank had watched silently until Eli finished the repair. Then he reached into his own pocket, removed the worn leather pouch, and placed it in Eli's hands. "Keep this," he had said quietly. "One day someone will trust a computer more than their own eyes. Do not make the same mistake." The memory lingered with extraordinary clarity as the sounds of the present slowly returned. The distant hum of generators replaced jungle insects. The smell of fresh pavement pushed away damp earth. Eli opened his eyes beneath the brilliant American sky and looked once again at the silent Huey waiting patiently before him. The access panel reflected the afternoon light exactly as it had inside his memory decades earlier. It was not coincidence. It was experience recognizing a familiar whisper that time had never managed to erase. Airman Ethan Cole could not explain what unsettled him. It was not the conversation itself. Mechanics argued every day. Experience challenged procedure. Procedure challenged instinct. That was ordinary. What felt different was the way Eli Harrison never once tried to win the argument. Every answer came quietly, almost as if the old veteran expected no one to believe him, yet had already accepted that truth did not depend upon agreement. Ethan looked from the silent Huey to the weathered leather tool pouch hanging at Eli's side. It was old enough to belong in a museum, yet Eli carried it with the casual familiarity of someone carrying an ordinary wrench. Nothing about the elderly man suggested attention, and yet everything about him quietly demanded it. Kyle Mercer had already returned to his diagnostic tablet, determined to prove that modern engineering would eventually solve the mystery. Lieutenant Noah Brooks reviewed the restoration checklist once more, comparing each completed inspection against Army maintenance procedures. Around them, the flight line settled into its steady rhythm as utility trucks rolled past, distant rotor blades turned above another section of the airfield, and warm summer wind carried the smell of fuel and fresh-cut grass across the concrete. Eli remained exactly where he was, his eyes never leaving the helicopter. Ethan found himself walking several steps away before stopping beside a maintenance cart. He looked back one more time. The old man had not moved an inch. It was the stillness that caught his attention. Everyone else searched for answers. Eli seemed to be waiting for one. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He hesitated. Calling someone outside the chain of maintenance over a feeling alone sounded foolish. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. A few seconds later, he took it out again. Earlier that morning, while helping prepare the ceremony, Ethan had overheard two senior officers discussing a delayed arrival. One name had stayed with him because everyone nearby had immediately lowered their voices. General Daniel Whitmore. Ethan remembered another detail as well. Someone had mentioned that if the restoration encountered any unexpected issue, the general wanted to be informed immediately before public announcements were made. At the time, Ethan assumed they were referring to scheduling. Now he was not so sure. He stepped farther away from the maintenance crew until the conversation behind him faded beneath the distant sound of aircraft engines. His thumb hovered over the contact number posted for the general's administrative office. He stared at the screen for several long seconds before pressing the call button. A calm voice answered almost immediately. Ethan swallowed once before introducing himself. "This is Airman Ethan Cole from the restoration team at Fort Redstone. I apologize for calling unexpectedly." The staff officer politely asked whether there was a safety emergency. "No, sir," Ethan answered honestly. "The aircraft is secure." A brief silence followed. "Then what is the concern?" Ethan looked across the flight line toward Eli Harrison. The old veteran still stood beside the silent Huey without saying a word. "I do not know exactly how to explain it," Ethan admitted. "There is an elderly mechanic here. Everyone believes he is mistaken. I think everyone might be looking at the wrong person." Another pause settled over the line before the staff officer asked one simple question that caused Ethan's heartbeat to quicken. "What is the gentleman's name?" Ethan glanced toward the faded name stitched above the pocket of the old field jacket. "Eli Harrison," he answered quietly. The silence on the other end became so complete that Ethan instinctively lowered the phone to make sure the call had not disconnected. The line remained silent for nearly 5 seconds before the staff officer spoke again. But the calm professionalism from only moments earlier had completely disappeared. "Airman Cole," the voice said carefully, "do not end this call." Ethan straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir." He heard papers moving rapidly, followed by a muffled conversation somewhere beyond the receiver. Another voice entered briefly, asking for confirmation. "Did you say Eli Harrison?" the second officer asked. "Yes, sir," Ethan answered. "He is standing with the restoration crew beside the Huey." More silence followed, but this silence carried urgency instead of uncertainty. Ethan watched Kyle Mercer kneeling beside the helicopter once again, reviewing another digital checklist while Lieutenant Noah Brooks discussed possible replacement components with the engineering team. Nobody seemed to notice that anything unusual was happening. Finally, the first officer returned. His tone had become formal, measured, and unmistakably serious. "Airman Cole, listen carefully. Do not allow Mr. Harrison to leave the aircraft. Do not ask him to perform any work. Do not remove him from the area. General Daniel Whitmore is on his way." Ethan blinked in disbelief. "Sir, should I inform Lieutenant Brooks?" "Not yet. Should I explain why?" "No." Ethan swallowed. "Yes, sir." The call ended, leaving only the quiet hum of the flight line around him. For several moments, he simply stood there holding the phone, trying to understand what had just happened. He looked back toward Eli Harrison. The elderly veteran had not changed position. One hand still rested lightly against the old leather tool pouch, while his attention remained fixed on the silent helicopter. It was almost impossible to believe that a single name had transformed a routine maintenance call into something important enough to interrupt a general. Ethan walked back toward the group, careful to hide the growing tension in his face. Kyle looked up briefly. "Did you finally call someone who knows how to fix this thing?" he joked. Ethan forced a small smile. "I made a call." Kyle laughed. "Good. Maybe they can. Send another engineer." Ethan said nothing. Across the flight line, a pair of military police motorcycles suddenly appeared from the far entrance road. Their lights flashed silently as they moved with steady purpose toward the maintenance hangars instead of the visitor parking area. A black staff vehicle followed close behind, its polished surface reflecting the bright afternoon sun. Lieutenant Brooks noticed the approaching convoy first. He frowned slightly. "That is unusual." One of the senior maintenance supervisors lowered the clipboard in his hands and turned toward the road. Conversations gradually faded as more people realized the vehicles were heading directly toward their section of the airfield. Nobody spoke. Nobody understood why a command convoy would interrupt preparations for what had been scheduled as an ordinary restoration ceremony. Kyle stood and brushed the dust from his gloves before looking toward the approaching vehicles with mild curiosity. "Must be another inspection," he said. Eli Harrison finally lifted his eyes from the helicopter and quietly watched the convoy approach without the slightest trace of surprise. There was no excitement in his expression, no anxiety, only the calm recognition of someone who had learned long ago that some moments arrived exactly when they were supposed to. As the lead vehicle rolled to a smooth stop only a short distance from the silent Huey, every conversation on the flight line came to an end, and the only sound left was the gentle wind moving through the motionless rotor blades above them. The rear door of the black staff vehicle opened before the engine had fully stopped. Every conversation across the flight line vanished as General Daniel Whitmore stepped onto the concrete with measured confidence. His pressed uniform reflected the afternoon sunlight, but it was not the rank on his shoulders that captured everyone's attention. It was the direction of his first step. He did not walk toward Lieutenant Noah Brooks. He did not acknowledge the restoration supervisors waiting beside the aircraft. He walked directly toward Eli Harrison. Kyle Mercer instinctively straightened his posture, expecting a formal inspection or a briefing about the ceremony. Instead, the general stopped a few feet in front of the elderly veteran and smiled with unmistakable recognition. "Mr. Harrison," he said warmly, "I was hoping I would find you before this helicopter embarrassed all of us." Eli returned the smile with quiet familiarity. "It has been a long time, General." Without another word, General Whitmore came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. The movement was so unexpected that nobody reacted for several seconds. Lieutenant Brooks stared in complete disbelief. Kyle remained frozen beside the engine cowling, his tablet slowly slipping from beneath his arm until he caught it against his side. The general lowered his hand only after Eli acknowledged the gesture with a respectful nod. "You earned that salute many years ago," Whitmore said softly. "I have simply been waiting for another chance to give it." Complete silence settled across the flight line. Even the distant maintenance crews seemed to pause as warm wind drifted beneath the motionless rotor blades. General Whitmore turned toward the gathered technicians. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "before any of you were born, this man kept aircraft flying under conditions that no simulator can recreate and no software can fully explain. If Eli Harrison says this helicopter is trying to tell us something, then we listen." Kyle felt the heat rush into his face. Every confident statement he had made throughout the afternoon echoed back through his memory with painful clarity. He looked toward Eli, expecting satisfaction or quiet triumph, but found neither. The elderly veteran simply stood with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. There was no desire to prove anyone wrong, only concern for the helicopter waiting silently before him. General Whitmore stepped aside and gestured toward the Huey. "Mr. Harrison," he said, "if you are willing, this aircraft is yours." Eli slowly removed the old leather tool pouch from his jacket pocket. The worn buckle clicked softly as he opened it, revealing a handful of carefully maintained hand tools polished by decades of honest work. He selected a single box wrench, whose chrome had faded from years of use. No expensive electronic equipment followed. No digital scanner. No specialized computer. Only a simple tool that fit naturally into his weathered hand. He approached the small access panel with deliberate care while everyone watched in absolute silence. Instead of immediately removing the bolts, Eli rested his fingertips against the painted metal and closed his eyes for a brief moment, almost like greeting an old friend after many years apart. Then he opened his eyes, looked toward Kyle, and spoke without judgment. "Would you hand me your flashlight?" Kyle blinked in surprise before hurrying forward. Without hesitation, he placed the flashlight into Eli's waiting hand, and for the first time that afternoon, respect quietly replaced certainty. The beam from Kyle Mercer's flashlight swept across the narrow compartment as Eli Harrison loosened the first bolt with slow, practiced movements that wasted neither effort nor motion. Every pair of eyes followed the old wrench as though the simple tool carried more authority than every computer sitting open across the flight line. The final bolt came free with a gentle metallic click. Eli carefully lifted the access panel and held it in place for a moment before directing the flashlight deeper inside. "There," he said quietly. Nobody spoke. Kyle leaned closer until his shoulder nearly touched Eli's. At first, he saw nothing except neatly routed wiring and polished brackets installed during the restoration. Then the narrow beam caught a faint shine where a small support bracket pressed against a cable bundle. The contact was almost invisible, no wider than the edge of a coin, but the bracket had shifted just enough under normal vibration to place steady pressure on the harness whenever the engine settled into position. The damage had not occurred yet. Every electrical test had passed because every wire remained intact. The problem existed only when weight, vibration, and time came together in exactly the wrong way. Eli smiled gently. She was warning you before she failed. He reached into the compartment, loosened 2 fasteners, repositioned the bracket by less than 1/4 inch, and tightened everything back into place with quiet confidence. There was nothing dramatic about the repair. No complicated procedure. No expensive replacement. Only experience recognizing what measurements alone could not. Eli stepped back and returned the flashlight to Kyle with a grateful nod. Would you like to do the honors? Kyle stared at him for a moment before climbing into the cockpit. His hands no longer carried the certainty they had shown earlier that afternoon. He completed the startup checklist exactly as he had several times before. The switch moved into position. A brief pause followed. Then the old helicopter answered. The engine awakened with a deep, familiar rumble that rolled gently across the flight line before the rotor blades began turning one slow revolution after another. Warm air spread outward as the unmistakable rhythm of the Huey filled the afternoon sky. No one cheered. No one shouted. The sound itself was enough. Kyle slowly climbed back down from the cockpit, removed his gloves, and walked directly toward Eli. Sir, he said quietly, I spent all day trying to prove the computer was right. I never thought to ask what the helicopter was trying to tell me. Eli rested a hand lightly on the younger man's shoulder. The computer was not wrong, he answered with a kind smile. It simply answered a different question. General Daniel Whitmore looked across the gathering of technicians before speaking one final time. Technology will always move forward, he said. But wisdom only survives when someone chooses to pass it on. Kyle looked at the old leather tool pouch one last time, realizing its greatest value had never been the tools inside. It had carried decades of observation, patience, humility, and lessons that no manual could ever fully capture. As the Huey continued turning beneath the bright American sky, Eli quietly closed the worn buckle, slipped the pouch back into his jacket, and walked away without waiting for applause. Behind him, every technician remained standing in thoughtful silence, listening to the steady heartbeat of a helicopter that had finally found someone who still remembered how to listen. Some machines remember the hands that once kept them flying, and some people never stop teaching, even after the world forgets their name.